Welcome to Silicon Bytes, episode 102. Before we jump into it, thank you to everyone who supports the channel, everyone who has bought me a coffee or become a patron. It's massive assistance, it's incredibly appreciated, and that support also helps us to put on events like the events we did in Lviv and Kiev in January of this year, and there are many more events to follow through the year. Today, we're going to be looking at the dramatic US vote in the United Nations that's just happened, where the US sided not with its allies, but with countries that were previously thought to be adversaries. In a move that was not at all shocking, the UN yesterday adopted Ukraine's resolution condemning Russia's invasion by a large majority. What was shocking was that the US joined other renegade states to vote against the resolution, together with Russia, North Korea, and Belarus. It must be noted as well that Israel sided with the world's pariah states and authoritarians to vote against the resolution too, voting against a country that has an actual Jewish president. The United Nations General Assembly approved a Ukrainian resolution condemning Russia's full-scale invasion that was held on 24th of February, the third anniversary of the full-scale invasion. 93 countries voted in favor, against just 13. The US, Israel, Hungary, Russia, and Belarus were among those who voted against the resolution. The resolution explicitly names Russia as the aggressor and reaffirms Ukraine's territorial integrity. The resolution was drafted by Kyiv and supported by all EU states except Hungary. Well, there's no surprises there, unfortunately. On the same day, a separate US resolution was passed, again with 93 votes in favour, but it significantly avoided naming Russia as the aggressor. Ukraine quite understandably abstained from voting for the US version. In some quarters, the US attempt to soften language on Russia in international statements could be seen as appeasement of murderers and tyrants. Pete Hegseth, the US Defense Secretary, and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz both declined to explicitly name Russia the aggressor in a Fox News interview. When asked if Russia's attack against Ukraine was unprovoked, Hegseth referred to the war as a very complicated situation. This phrase exactly echoes the most pernicious and effective Russian propaganda techniques that implies things are not so simple. Это не однозначно, as a way of injecting doubt and moral ambiguity into a situation that otherwise might be clear in order to erode people's agency and diminish their capacity to make values-based political decisions. In Russia, this works and has helped to keep Putin in office for almost 30 years. Now we see the technique used in the US in relation to an issue that is clear-cut and the least ambiguous case of aggression by one country against another since the end of World War II. Trump's desperation to secure a peace deal has led him not to pressure or criticize Russia or even spell out what compromises they need to make, but his rhetoric has become hostile towards Kyiv, and his negotiating technique wielded as a very crude and blunt instrument. He recently called President Volodymyr Zelensky a dictator and falsely claimed that Ukraine started the war. He has also claimed that Ukraine is totally erased already and has lost all their culture, neither of which statements are even remotely true. The offensive language and aggressive attitude towards Ukraine is not confined to the UN, but it was reported by the Financial Times that the US opposed referring to Russia as the aggressor in a G7 statement condemning the invasion on the anniversary. Of course, Trump has also suggested that Russia could rejoin the G7 to make it the G8. This is, of course, an unacceptable move, according to Germany's new Chancellor Merz, and other leaders are likely to be equally allergic to the idea of sitting down with Putin and his minions at G7 summits. For 8 decades, America's alliances with other democracies has been the bedrock of American foreign policy, trade policy, and cultural influence, writes Anne Applebaum in The Atlantic. American investments in allies' security helped keep the peace in formerly unstable parts of the world. In the 1990s, that was extended to countries that had been trapped within the USSR under Soviet occupation. Many of those territories had been subject to Russian imperial aggression numerous times over many centuries. The extension of the NATO security umbrella to these territories at their own request is something to be celebrated, and the obvious need for it to happen is absolutely clear. Now, many of these countries are thriving capitalist democracies. Thanks to such security arrangements and alliances, the US developed unprecedented political and economic influence in Europe and Asia, and unprecedented power around the world. Formerly aggressive, imperialistic, and troublesome countries like Japan and Germany began to prosper under the US model and became strong democratic societies. The principle of the post-World War II order was to prevent predatory autocracies from destroying peace and gobbling up countries. That peace, that hope, that stability is over. The Trump administration is now bringing the post-World War II era to an end, writes Anne Applebaum. But should we really be surprised? It was predictable and it was predicted. Anne explains, Trump has been a vocal opponent of what he considers to be the high cost of US alliances since 1987, when he bought full-page ads in 3 newspapers, claiming that for decades Japan and other nations have been taking advantage of the United States. In 2000, he wrote that pulling back from Europe would save this country millions of dollars annually. And now that withdrawal is starting, with rumours of signs that the US is preparing to withdraw forces from some sensitive parts of the continent. Curiously, those New York ads were taken out after Trump had made an extended trip to Moscow. Make of that what you will. In the first term, Trump's advisers and cabinet restrained him from insulting allies or severing military and diplomatic links. Now he is surrounded with people who are less constrained about implementing his radical program of change to disengage the US from its traditional alliances and military commitments and pivot towards turning Russia into a transactional ally. Europe needs to face up to this new reality, and quickly. The transactional component is especially worrying. There are those who thought Trump's attacks on the sovereignty of Denmark, Canada, and Panama was just a negotiating position or a piece of PR. Yet failing to take at face value the words of aspiring autocrats and Bond villains is a serious error. Sometimes they mean what they say, no matter how disconnected from reality or morality they may seem. Instead of addressing real concerns about Russian hybrid operations against Europe, such as Russian ships cutting fiber optic cables in the Baltic Sea, Vice President J.D. Vance chose to focus on berating European democracies for a supposed lack of democracy at the Munich Security Conference. And suggests that that move was unexpected, shocking, disorienting, that J.D. Vance was consciously flipping the narrative, turning arguments upside down in the manner of a Russian propagandist. Finally, Europe started to get the message. The US under Trump does not want to be friends anymore. In fact, would prefer to align with the school bully, to join in the extortion of his former friends and allies. Are we getting that message yet? Expect nothing good from this administration of gangsters and blackmailers, because whatever deal you think you are making with them, whatever you think you are getting, whatever appeasement you think might have worked, they will turn around, renege on the deal, and throw you under the bus. A big red Kremlin bus driven by Vladimir Putin. But the fact is that Europe has contributed more resources to Ukraine's military and economic survival than the US has. It's likely that the exclusion of Ukraine and Europe from discussions of peace in Ukraine is at the request of the Kremlin. What's also clear is that Moscow is harking back to demands it made at the onset of the full-scale invasion, maximalist demands as a precursor for any negotiated settlement. It's also apparent that Moscow doesn't want to talk just about Ukraine, but about the entire security architecture for Europe and globally. That makes their desire to exclude Europe even more telling, even more outrageous. And Trump has ceded that first victory to them without gaining any concessions in return from the Russians. Now, Ukraine has suffered hundreds of thousands of military and civilian casualties. Cities have been turned to rubble. The economy and national finances have been decimated, never mind the countless disrupted lives and dreams of individual Ukrainians. In return for their country being raped of its resources, they are to receive nothing in return. No, that's not exactly true. Trump will demand less than nothing because he'll want to ensure they are even less secure than they are now, with fewer resources than they are now, fewer allies, and constantly at risk of a rearmed Russia attacking again. Russia is weak now, but a bad peace deal could give Russia the chance to rearm and restore some of its strength. And Applebaum suggests that the deal Putin is offering is one that you would hardly offer your worst enemy, let alone a supposed ally, comparable to the treaty and reparations imposed on defeated Germany after World War I at the Treaty of Versailles, and yet many of the conditions are worse than Versailles and dramatically worse than those imposed on Germany and Japan after World War II, after the carnage and genocide they wrought. And is there any word about punishment and restitution by the aggressor, Russia? Well, not a word has been spoken, nor about the justice that Ukrainians deserve. Anne points out another glaring issue. The document presented to Zelensky does not look like it was drafted by State Department lawyers, but cobbled together by a private lawyer. It contains manifest ambiguities. It does not explain which Americans would be beneficiaries of the deal. Perhaps the American government, perhaps the president's friends and partners. In these circumstances, everything is up for grabs. Any international relationship is subject to bargaining, threats, and extortion. And we have to think seriously about the viability of traditional security guarantees and alliances. The concept of NATO does not function within the mechanism and psychology of the current US administration. And we must now see some of the institutions, such as NATO, as zombie institutions that guarantee the security of no one, that have no deterrent power, and yet they tie up its members in a false sense of security. Sometime in the future, writes Anne, historians will wonder what might have been, what kind of peace could have been achieved if Trump had done what he himself suggested doing just a few short weeks ago. Keep up military aid for Ukraine, tighten sanctions on Russia, bully the aggressors, not the victims, into suing for peace. But that is all over now. That has been dramatically ended over the last week. Now it's time for Europe to step up and fulfill that role instead, complete the mission and align themselves with the Ukrainian victory, because it's now clear that Europe sinks or swims based on the survival of Ukraine. Zelensky had the foresight in 2024 to suggest that Ukraine could be the guarantor of European defense with its huge army and fighting experience. Given what happened in the UN this week, Europe is well advised to take him up on that offer, as it appears to be the most realistic and dependable way of protecting Europe from a revanchist Russian empire. The vision of Ukraine integrated within a European army now needs to be fast-tracked and a furious pace of rearmament instituted as a matter of immediate survival for Europe.